Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video, we're going to continue our series on rifle grip. Just going to go ahead and follow gravity down and start talking about kneeling positions. Following the natural order of things, like I said, following gravity down, the standing positions, our standing rifle grip, that's probably going to be where we start. So we covered that in a previous video. Now we're going to start talking about kneeling positions. There's a few different kneeling positions that can be very advantageous on the rifle. And of course, kneeling is one of those positions that either we can choose to be in or we can be forced into it by the situation and the context of the events that are taking place. So understanding the limitations of kneeling is super important, but also understanding how your grip may have to change based on the kneeling position and how you can get additional points of contact on the rifle to increase accuracy, especially at longer ranges, is very beneficial. Kneeling is kind of it's an intuitive position because we use kneeling a lot to bend down, pick things up, do things like that. But when we factor in a rifle or even a handgun, it does slightly change what we're going to do. Now, we do have that intuitive sense of balance, which greatly aids in our ability to just naturally kneel without any real formal instruction. But there's some fine tuning you can do when you actually start working with the rifle that you may be able to find, or you may be able to see with what I'm going to show you, a way to be more stable than you thought you could be, or maybe you thought like, okay, the kneeling I've been doing, the kneeling positions I've been using have been super stable. And then maybe you try one of the things that I'm going to cover in this video and you're like, you know what, I didn't know that position could get more stable. So I'm going to cover just a few different grip options for the kneeling position and try to put them in context. Now, as I mentioned, kneeling is a position that we can choose to be in, such as using cover, shooting underneath objects, shooting underneath low-hanging branches, things of that nature, using concealment, or it's a position that we can be forced into. You take fire, you have to suck into cover, or you duck underneath an object when you're actually moving through an area where you have to go into a kind of a kneeling position to kind of assess the situation before you move forward. So the environment can kind of dictate if we have to use kneeling or not, and so can our threat. When it comes to the kneeling position, the easiest way to kneel is to just simply do it. But when you factor in the rifle, there are sometimes I see some misunderstandings with what you actually gain by just simply kneeling. So if I were to take my rifle like this and just simply kneel down, have I actually increased my stability? If you think about it, I really haven't, because this is the same position I'm in standing. I'm in that thumb forward grip, my shovel or my broomstick grip, as I mentioned from the previous video, and I'm literally just lowering my elevation to a kneeling position. I haven't actually increased my stability on the weapon. I have widened my base. Think about it like this. So here's my kneeling position. It's no different than if I was using a handgun. This kneeling position doesn't actually increase my stability. All it does is give me a wider base, which arguably increases my stability as a whole, but it doesn't increase my ability to stable the rifle itself. So that is a functionally useful kneeling position. If I got to take a low shot or something like that, it's very simple to just snap into it and get my shots. But at this position, in this grip, there is no functional difference between this and this. So when we talk about actually assuming the kneeling position, there's generally two techniques. I only really advocate one of them, and that's one knee down, where I literally control my descent the entire time. And I have to pick a knee, which knee goes down. We'll get to that. And the other technique is simply a speed kneel, where I'll snap in and literally just go down. And while that looks really cool, it's very terrain dependent. I guarantee you, if you do that on gravel, you will only do it once. If you do it on concrete, you may never be able to do it again. So the environment is going to dictate if you can use that. Is it faster? Absolutely. I encourage that in an emergency situation where you literally have to get down that second, or maybe you needed to get down a second ago. But for a controlled, conscious kneeling, not a reaction to a threat, so to speak, I wouldn't really advocate its use, again, unless it's an emergency situation. The reason for that is, one, the pain that can be produced. There is such a thing as manning up, but there's a huge difference between discomfort, pain, and injury. That kneeling is likely to produce something in the last two categories there. Pain and injury are real things, and while you can move through them, I want to stay at 100% as long as I possibly can. So when I do kneel, I want it to be controlled. If I do that speed kneel where I just go down, if I have to change my mind, I get to a certain point where I can't. So as I descend on two knees, once I get to a certain point, I can't change my mind. I'm literally committed. Gravity's like, nope, bro, we're going down. If I'm in a one knee controlled descent and something happens to where I change my mind, it's easy for me to just reset out of it. Now, range of motion obviously is going to be a pretty significant factor for a lot of people when it comes to kneeling. Some people may not have the physical condition to even do an emergency speed kneel. My personal advice, try it, know how to do it, and you may find yourself reflexively doing it in an unfortunate situation. But the one knee down controlled kneel is what I consider the foundation for all the kneeling positions that we're going to cover. So the next question is, which knee down? Well, my personal feeling is I'm going to start default just with that kneeling rifle position. So I'm going to go rifle side down. So primary side down. And the reason I'm going to do that is because as I start to utilize this, I'm going to need this arm to make contact with the knee. If I go support side down, all I really have, if I want to gain an additional point of contact, is an elbow. And we don't want to put elbows on thighs because they roll. We also don't want to put elbows on knees because they both roll. So what we're going to talk about is the default, which knee down. My personal advice to you again, and we'll get into that, is primary side down is going to be more useful in most situations, but there is a context, which we'll get into, where you might want to go support side down. So here we are, primary knee down. Starting with just our default, our primary knee down, what I consider a default kneeling position, just because it's going to give us that instantaneous access to additional stability on the rifle if we want it, if we need it. Obviously, we can still shoot. We already talked about that. It's going to be functionally the same, but if I need to add support to the rifle, I can change my grip. Now, how much you change your grip is going to depend on your rail length. The more rail you have available to you, the more you can control this position. So instead of what you may have seen, kind of a cup grip, just flat palm, and someone will make contact, they'll put that knee on their elbow on their knee. We don't want to do that because that rolls. One thing we want to do, if we can, is we want to maintain that 90-degree angle to kind of increase our maximum stability. If we come in so far, longer rifles, forward leaning, we may actually limit our stability. So we want as much 90-degree angle as we can get out of that support side leg. What I'm going to do is I've got two options. The first option, depending on elevation, is literally use my tricep area on my knee. It's not ideal, but the situation can allow it. And I can roll back as far as my range of motion will allow and really lock in. This position gives me one more solid point of contact, almost like a monopod on the rifle to increase stability. Now, one of the problems with this position that some people have is they try to fight it. So they'll lock into it, and then when they want to make an adjustment, they'll literally try to drive the gun around, which if you have the luxury of time, what you'd rather do is just make minor corrections in your position to adjust your natural point of aim. Make minor adjustments. The further out I come on the rail, the lower the barrel goes. The further back I come on the rail, the higher the barrel goes, so on and so forth. A variation of that technique is to use the outside of the tricep on the inside of the knee, like so. This position is a little bit more compact. To me, it's a little bit more comfortable. There is a little bit of isometric pressure here because there's nothing pinning my arm in. So I am maintaining a slight degree of pressure inward on my leg, which can fatigue you quicker than this position. But my problem using this one is that knee, that's a round surface. Even with solid downward pressure, just the weight of the rifle, the weight of my arm, there is the chance that it can start to roll a little bit on you. So just sinking into it, just like that, very, very stable. If I want increased stability, if I got to change position, I can make minor adjustments instead of trying to fight the gun. Now, if you remember from the standing grip video, I talked about the Olympic grip. If I'm in a kneeling position, a one knee down, primary side down position, and I have the luxury of time, and I need to minimize my profile, just like I can use my traditional standing full arm extended grip, I can also use that Olympic grip. All I got to do is go to a two knees down position and rotate my body, and I can get right back into that same exact position. Now, the usefulness of this position entirely dependent on the situation. I wouldn't advise it because it takes so much time to get into and out of. It is a position, like I said, where you have a luxury of time. Stability, environment may create a situation where a traditional kneeling position just isn't possible by the confines that you have to shoot from. So it's good to know that this grip works, this position works, standing as well as kneeling. Now, our kneeling grip takes on much more context when we start talking about the use of cover. If you remember from past videos where I talked about cover is usually not as convenient as it is on the range. I got these two 55-gallon drums And they simulate like maybe a concrete pillar or something like that, maybe even a tree, a very large old tree, but not a whole lot of stability there. So if I wanted to dig into the cover, for instance, using a variation of my grip, I can't really practice for that here on these barrels. These barrels, variations of these barrels, blue barrels, orange roach cones, all those things are used because they're cheap or free, and you're not really losing anything if they do get shot up. Even if you spray paint "do not shoot" on them, people still shoot them. So when we start talking about the kneeling position, dealing with cover, we need to start thinking about, instead of just mindlessly, or not mindlessly, but just procedurally using the object as an, okay, well, I'm behind it, but are you actually behind it? And this is where, if you think back to when I was just talking about which leg down, which leg up when you go into that kneeling position, this is where it actually starts to have a really contextual meaning when we actually start working cover. Now, this cover is what I call a soft angle because it's round. A hard angle, that 90-degree angle, such as a wall or something like that, the corner of a building, that's going to give you a much more definitive edge to kind of predict your exposure than, say, this soft angle, which is a radius, which you may think, okay, I'm behind it, and then you get a pain penalty that tells you you're not actually behind it. Now, as an example of what I'm talking about, here's a lower object. Here's our lower cover object. It's obviously taller than it is wide, so that kind of dictates a kneeling position may be doable. But if I'm going to train and practice on something like this, I have to factor in, okay, what in the real world actually looks like this, and how is my kneeling position going to benefit me from behind it? If our kneeling position isn't being used for increased stability, then we're using it to suck up or to utilize cover for whatever reason. Cover is technically infinite. Some cover is linear, some cover isn't. Different conversation. But what I'm talking about is I can utilize this piece of cover from any relative distance as long as I line it up with my threat. And there may be a benefit to that I don't suck up to my cover. So using the camera's point of view as an example, if the camera is the threat, how kneeling do I have to get to actually utilize this piece of cover? So if I come in, I'm kneeling right now. I'm using my traditional grip, but am I really concealing a whole lot of my body? Can you see my leg? Can you see my head? Can you see my upper high thoracic cavity? Now, one solution would be to suck into the cover, but now I've limited my rifle's mobility, which isn't a good thing. So we start talking about those alternate positions or sinking down behind it. The lower I can get, the higher my range of motion in my kneeling position, the better off I'm going to be. So if I sink down really low, now I am really giving away less of my body as I engage my threat. I do decrease my mobility by sinking into that position, but obviously the benefit is if this is actually hard cover, then the benefit is it's actually hard cover and I got almost every inch of my body that I can behind it. Now, talk about that one knee up, one knee down. As you notice, my primary side is down. That's my default position. The reason being is I can get lower on my exposure side because, you know, I want to default to my right shoulder because I'm shooting the rifle with my right shoulder. I'm low, and it allows me to sink even lower. If I were to put this knee down, it increases my stability to keep me from falling over, especially if I'm working with a partner and I'm low, he's high, that kind of thing. But it doesn't allow me to get as low and expose myself to engage the threat. So I can't really work the angle quite as well. What's the difference? Well, the difference is literally a range of motion, so it's a personal issue. For you, it might not be that big of a deal. For me, it's kind of significant just based on, you know, pre-existing conditions and things like that. So again, kneeling, like a lot of other things, very personal thing. If you have really good range of motion, you might not notice the effect. There is a distinct benefit to keeping your outside knee up, and that is stability. The advantage of keeping it down is I can bend over further, work my way around a little bit better, and shrink down a little bit more to my support side as I expose my rifle side to engage the threat. Now looking at it from a side profile, you can see how the problem can create itself. You know, one of the things about working cover is maneuvering the rifle, staying far enough off the cover. We just have this natural desire. I see it all the time with people who are new to using cover, especially in force-on-force classes. They have this natural desire to want to get as close to the cover as they can. Remember I talked about, as long as you can put that object between you and your threat and minimize your exposure using that object, cover works. Getting into that, if I suck in low, handgun rifle, it limits my ability to get the rifle up. So if I come in hot, I'm going to have to reacquaint myself with the cover, and I'm going to have to move the rifle around it, versus if I come in just a little further off, no matter how I come in, I prefer to come into cover in a high port, if you want to call it that. And literally from here, I can start to maneuver the gun without worrying about interfering with the cover. If I'm going to use the cover for support, that's great. I have that plan ahead of time. I can go ahead and barricade in, get as low as I can while I'm doing that, but risk versus reward. If I'm going to use the cover to hard support the gun, I'm probably going to expose more of myself than if I literally just got as low as I possibly could and worked the cover like that. So if I were to go primary side knee up, like we talked about, keep that knee, keep that whole leg as far behind this this radius as I can to avoid that pain penalty, I literally just can't get as low as I normally would. Start thinking about gear. If you're wearing a plate carrier, battle belt, things like that, you got magazines on your belt, all these things are going to push against your rib cage, your abdomen. They're literally going to prevent you from being able to bend over as far as you can. So exposure side, I prefer to go knee down. That way, even with all this kit, I can still get low and work that angle. So the next point of context is exposure side. Ideally, if I'm right-handed, or I'm right-hand dominant when it comes to the rifle, I want to use right side exposure because that's my default side, and despite all the practice to the contrary, I'm probably going to shoot a little bit faster, a little bit better from that side of my body. What if I don't have a right side exposure? Say I'm, you know, it's just contextually, I only have a left side exposure. I'm on the left corner of the building, I got to use that left side. Or for whatever reason I can't go in this direction. There's a wall, a corner, a bush, a car, another shooter, what have you. So how do I transfer control of the rifle, change my grip to use kneeling position behind this piece of cover to the best advantage? Now, I want to keep my exposure knee down, but I have to move the rifle over. So I've got a couple of choices. The first thing I can do is do a knee switch and then literally bump the rifle over to my left shoulder. This still allows me to get just as low and lean out as far. The only issue with it is, since it's not a full transfer of rifle control, I lose extension on my support hand, so my hand starts to ride back a little bit further on the rifle, which is something you can definitely confirm for yourself. Obviously, the issue with that is stability. The gain here in bumping over is it's so much faster, relatively speaking, than transferring full control of the rifle to my left shoulder. But that's also an option based on the situation. Me personally, it's contextual. If I get up to this piece of cover and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna be here for 2-3 shots and I'm moving on, or I'm just gonna be here to observe, gather a little intel and I'm moving on, I may not transfer the rifle completely to the left side of my body, especially if, as a left side exposure, if I see a right side exposure over there that I can use that's just as good, risk versus reward, I may move to that one just so I can use the default side of my body. But this is all I got. If I know I'm gonna be here for a while, I'm probably gonna transfer control of the rifle completely over to the left side of my body, which is where slings come into play. So I don't wanna have to swim out of my sling to do it if I can avoid it, because I'm gonna transfer back. I don't wanna mess with it. Me personally, this is, you know, my personal opinion. So I'm in the rifle, I gotta go over here. So instead of swimming out, I'm literally just gonna transfer the rifle over and switch over. Because anytime my hands are on the rifle, I run my slack all the way out. It's very easy for me to do that. Now, this knee's already down, maintaining a good, getting it behind that radius or behind that hard angle, depending on the cover, to prevent that pain penalty. And then I can use the exact same grip, get low, lean out, do work. The last cover related issue we have to talk about as far as kneeling is concerned is if I'm gonna barricade or support off of that piece of cover. If I'm gonna suck in and use it for support, maybe I'm gonna go to a pull hand cue grip off of my vertical grip or my hand stop or whatever. I'm gonna get in there on the edge, try to get as low as I can. I'm going to expose more of myself than I normally would. If I'm gonna go to junkyard prone or you know, whatever you wanna call it, if I'm gonna go to off-axis shooting, I'm gonna lay the rifle on that piece of cover. At this point, I can go to 2 knees down and get even lower, just enough to get eye relief. Make sure, you know, my muzzle is clear of that cover object, especially this with the lip. You know, actually this barrel was cover. I want to be concerned about that. I'm going to use my hand to elevate that rail, but I can get even lower just by going to that 2 knee and sinking as much of my body down as I can. The problem, again, I'm reducing my mobility. It's a risk versus reward situation. Contextually, does that position make sense? For me, that position makes a lot more sense the further the threat or the target is away from me. So if they're super close and I'm worried about them flanking my cover, because that's always a concern, I'm probably not going to use the cover to support. the rifle, especially since I don't really have to. The closer they are, the easier, relatively speaking, they're going to be to hit. If they're further away or they're behind cover themselves and further away, I need to go for precision shooting, then that's the time when I'm going to barricade in. And I don't necessarily have to rest the rifle. If I use a hand stopper vertical grip, I can literally dig that into the surface and get that support. Remember, we talked about that in the last video, using that mag well as that additional point of contact. A lot of guys, what they do in this position is they come back here and support the stock like they do in prone. I don't really like that because to me, it's a waste of energy. Reason being, you're aggressively leaning into the rifle. This hand isn't going to do a whole lot. From up here, maybe it's going to add a little bit more stability to the center axis of the rifle as you control it. So I'm dug in, and I can use this hand to steer the gun. The shoulder just pushes, and that's all it's going to do. Obviously, your situation is going to determine what you have to do in regards to cover when you talk about kneeling. So, final thoughts on kneeling. Obviously, it's very contextual. You're probably getting tired of hearing that word, but that word, you know, it fits. It's what we have to talk about. In what situation are you going to have to kneel? And that is going to determine how you can kneel. Cover is obviously usually the first decision. Does the cover allow me to get low? How low does it allow me to get? How far away is my threat? How far away is my target for practice? Talking about practice. That's going to determine your ability to barricade off, use the cover support, or stay further off cover. In low light conditions, you probably have to suck up to the cover, you know, so you get your light past it so you don't backsplash yourself. But that's when kneeling really starts to take on a greater context and the techniques get a little bit more fluid. There's no staple way to say this is how you use a soft angle versus this is how you use a hard angle. This knee goes down, this knee goes up. It's all about personal range of motion, your natural intuitive ability to balance. If you start to lean out and you feel like, okay, I've got to work past an acute angle because my threat's now this way versus lined perfectly up with the cover, that's something you should be practicing to see where your range of motion is at. Usually when we set these drills up, I see people do it. I'm guilty of it myself sometimes. I set my piece of cover out that I know I'm going to use, and then I set my target up and I pretty much line my target up with my cover, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you think about it. If the cover is non-linear, such as these two barrels, which we're using to simulate like a concrete column or something like that, I can move freely around it and use it from any side. Not a lot of things out there are going to give you that versatility. There's some oddly shaped objects like cars and things like that, but trees. But think about the edge of a building or a concrete bollard, something that's more linear in nature. I may have to stay right where I'm at. I don't have the luxury of being able to work the cover or work the angle. So I've got to come around the cover and engage a threat that's now more acute than perfectly lined up. And that's going to definitely factor into your stability. So this knee, exposure side, knee down or up becomes a very personal decision. And then go back to, just because I feel like I'm behind cover, am I actually behind cover? When you practice this stuff at the range, when you're still cold, no guns, utilize your cover positions, have your practice partner go down range and say, yeah, you're good, man. You're really sucked in really good behind that cover. I'm not really seeing a whole lot of you, even when you lean out to engage. Or he could be like, man, you're all screwed up. Like, I can see your head, I can see your high thoracic, you got a knee sticking out, I can see your foot. Like, all of those things are going to be something that it's much easier for someone else to help us than for us to try to figure out on our own, because we're so close to that cover, we're not really sure how much of ourselves we're exposing to the target that's way down range, because angles change perspective based on how close or how far away from them you are. My personal advice, again, is this is something you can do without even puppet gunning. This is something you can do in the public. Work angles, work situations. Think about, you might not want to go around the mall or Walmart or anything and get into kneeling positions and check things out, and probably not a whole lot in Walmart's actually covered anyway. But you can visualize it and you can think about it. You can think, if it went down right now, how would I kneel and how would I utilize that piece of cover? How would I kneel and how do I utilize this piece of cover? Start conceptualizing those things, kind of wargaming it a little bit. That way, in the unlikely event, but possible event that you actually do have to utilize cover in a use of force encounter, you'll be much better prepared for it. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.